All right, well, thank you very much for joining us for our first panel today. We're going to be talking about rebalancing federal housing policy, the case for reforming the mortgage interest deduction. I'm Sarah Mickelson. I'm the Public Policy Director here at the National Income Housing Coalition. And I'm joined today with our panelists. We'll start with David Newville from CFED, Agatha from Raza, the National Council of Raza, Carol Wayman with Representative Keith Ellison's office, Democrat from Minnesota, and Sharon Cornu from the the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. Before I get started, I just want to set the stage a little for you about the mortgage interest deduction and why we're looking to reform it. If we could go to the next slide, that'd be great. Maybe the next one. One more slide, if we could. We can go. Sorry about that. All right, the United for Homes campaign. So for more than 10 years, the National Income Housing Coalition has been advocating for reforming the mortgage interest deduction. And now that tax reform is really taking off, this is a time that we've redoubled our efforts. We've relaunched our United for Homes campaign. And as Diane mentioned, it's never been more possible to see tax reform and also to see some important, smart changes to the mortgage interest deduction. It's a top priority for Congress going forward. Both the President and Congress have been looking forward to an opportunity to do tax reform for many, many years. They have campaigned on it. And now that we've seen Obamacare go away, or at least the repeal efforts for right now, tax reform is the next issue that they want to focus on because they think it could give them a big win. So they're putting a lot of effort and energy around it. And as I mentioned, we've been relaunching. What we have done is launched a new website, encourage everyone to check it out. New materials, collateral materials that you can use when you're going to the Hill to talk about MID reform. That includes state information, not only about who currently gets the mortgage interest deduction in your state, but also who's not getting it, and what it would mean if you were able to reform the mortgage interest deduction in terms of how many new affordable homes could be built, how many more people could be served through rental assistance and other sources. And so we encourage you to check that out. You'll learn a lot about what it means for your state and to share that information with your members of Congress. And so far, we've been working our way. Many of us are on the legislative committee of the United for Homes campaign. So that's the national group of endorsers. We've been talking through strategy and working to meet with members of Congress on the Hill. We've worked our way through every Ways and Means Committee member. So that's the committee that oversees tax reform in the House. We're working our way through the Senate right now, the Finance Committee. And what we've heard from every Republican office is that everything is on the table for tax reform, and many of them have said that they would be shocked if there weren't changes to MID. And so that is something that they're starting to talk about as they plan their tax reform efforts. They have a small working group that is working together to talk about what those changes could look like. But it's important to note that their interest in reforming the mortgage interest deduction is different than ours. They want to see those savings lower tax rates, whether it's on the corporate side for corporate tax rates or maybe on the individual side for more higher income households. We have a very different interest. We want to see that money reinvested into housing for people with the lowest incomes. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're all on the same page, we're organized, we're talking with the same voice, and talking to as many members of Congress as possible. And so, why reform the mortgage interest deduction? If we could go to the next slide, that'd be great. So I think Diane hit on this earlier. If you look at all the money that the federal government spends on housing, it's about $200 billion every year. And 3/4 of it, 75%, go to higher income households through the mortgage interest deduction and other homeownership tax benefits. So that means every year when we're fighting to preserve resources at HUD and USDA rural housing, we're really talking about just 1/4 of all of the dollars that are being spent. And And that's unfair, right? I mean, there's no other way to put it. That we're talking about resources for some of the lowest income people that we are fighting tooth and nail every year just to preserve, while we're seeing dollars spent through the mortgage interest deduction grow every year. And just to give you another sense of what that looks like, if you could go to the next slide. We spend more on the 7 million wealthiest homeowners in America than we do on the 55 million poorest people in America on housing. In this chart, at least you'll see on the blue, is how we currently spend the mortgage interest deduction. The mortgage interest deduction is a great example of just how regressive our tax code is. In blue, you'll see for the top 2 income brackets that we see there, families above $200,000, they receive about 40% of all the mortgage interest deduction dollars that are being spent. 80% of it goes to people earning more than $100,000 a year. And I think Diane also mentioned this before, but that means that even if you look at just the top 1%, they're receiving about $10 billion a year to help subsidize their homes, when at the same time we have homelessness rising in many communities. Many people are struggling to pay their rent. People who have the lowest incomes, extremely low income people, are suffering from huge shortages of affordable housing. And as a result, they have no other option but to live in housing that's really not affordable to them. They spend a greater and greater share of their income on rent. You know this as well as I, which leaves very little resources left over for food, for transportation, for health care, for everything else that people need in order to live thriving lives. So we're calling for 2 reforms with our campaign. If you could go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, this is another way of looking at it. I think this is so egregious when you look at where those dollars are spent. The people who are at the very top see the greatest benefit to the mortgage interest deduction. And the people at the very bottom see pennies on the dollar. If you could go to the next slide. So what do we want to do? We want to see some changes that will better serve both low and moderate income homeowners, but also benefit renters who are facing the greatest struggles. So the United for Homes campaign has called for 2 different reforms. The first is to lower the size of a mortgage that's eligible for the mortgage interest deduction. So currently it's at $1 million. We want to lower that to just $500,000. That impacts about 6% of all loans nationally. And even if you have a loan that's about $600,000, you can still get the mortgage interest deduction for the first $500,000 of it. So we're not excluding people from receiving a benefit. It's just really having some sort of limit at the top end. The second thing that we want to see is converting it from a deduction to a credit. So how many people know if they even itemize their taxes? I don't know. People know? Right. Half of all homeowners don't itemize their taxes. Many renters don't itemize their taxes. So that means that the only people who are actually receiving the mortgage interest deduction are that 25% of tax filers who are itemizing. And what does that mean to itemize? That means that the amount of money that you can get back in a deduction that you can get towards your tax liability is greater than what the standard deduction normally provides people. And usually people just take the standard deduction. This is if you are receiving even more resources back. So if you convert it into a credit, what you'll see is about 15 million more low and moderate income homeowners would get a tax break that they're not getting anymore. And together, those 2 reforms produce about $241 billion in savings over 10 years. And we want to see that reinvested into housing for people who have the lowest incomes. What does that mean? Maybe through the Housing Trust Fund, maybe through something that's been proposed by both conservatives and progressives, something like a renter's tax credit. There are other options that are out there that we need to see that money reinvested instead of going towards paying for lower tax rates. So when you're on the Hill tomorrow, it's included in your Hill materials, and you're talking to your members of Congress about why this is the time to reform the mortgage interest deduction. You should let them know our message is we need to keep housing dollars within housing. You know, for too long, these housing dollars have been going to people who really don't need it in order to live stable lives. These sort of reforms would free up money that we can reinvest back into housing, because we know that housing is an issue in every state and every congressional district. And so we can really take big steps towards addressing homelessness, addressing housing poverty, without adding a single penny to the deficit. So this is something that should be appealing to many members of Congress. I hope you take that message with you. We have about 2,300 organizations, national, state, and local organizations and government officials who've endorsed the campaign. When you go back home to your communities, I encourage you to sign on if you're not already an endorser. Ask your local city councils and local government officials to consider signing on as well, because the more support that we have from the field, the more powerful our voice is when Congress is going about tax reform. And we'll get into a little bit later about the bill that Representative Keith Ellison has introduced. Carol is here from his office, and she can talk about that in more detail. But I just wanted to flag that for you. And before we get into our panel discussion, I did want to show our first video, if we can. This is the first in a series that the United for Homes campaign is working on to show different perspectives from across the ideological spectrum about why we need to reform the mortgage interest deduction. So if we could, roll the video.
Our research shows that the affordable housing crisis for the lowest income people is pervasive. It impacts every community across the country, from urban to rural to suburban, every state, every congressional district, red states, blue states. It's a bipartisan issue.
Based on where I live, which is in Clarksville, Tennessee, we need more affordable housing. We do not have enough housing stock. With a voucher program that's going on Section 8, we want good quality homes for people to move in, and that's something we do not have.
We need more of all housing, but particularly affordable housing in this country. Housing is essentially one of the basic necessities of life. Without a place to live, without shelter, whether it's rental, whether it's homeowner, it's very hard to do a number of other things in life, such as have a job and have a stable family life. So housing really is the foundation upon which so many other things are built.
As a pediatrician, I am really seeing how the affordable housing crisis is playing out on the bodies of my patients. So often when I'm trying to treat a child for developmental delay or for growth delay or other things, that's really just the symptom of the disease. The underlying disease is really the lack of affordable housing. The good news is we don't lack solutions. There are a number of proven, effective programs that were created precisely to meet this need. The National Housing Trust Fund program is a good example. The Section 8 voucher program is another highly successful, proven program that helps the poorest families pay their rent on the private market. About 10 years ago, I started thinking about a stable, decent home that you could afford could be like a vaccine. It keeps you healthy now and in the future. The reason for that, in our research at Children's Health Watch, we looked at a vulnerable subgroup, families that were food insecure. And we looked at those that received housing subsidies versus those that were eligible but not able to receive them. The kids in the families that were food insecure but getting the housing subsidy were twofold less likely to be stunted in their growth because they had that protection from the housing subsidy. In the United States, we spend about $200 billion a year to help Americans buy and rent their homes. And the bulk of these resources, a full 3/4 of it, goes to subsidize higher income homeowners, almost all of whom would be stably housed without the government's help.
To get the mortgage introduction, you have to itemize, and most taxpayers actually do not itemize. Even about half of homeowners who don't itemize. So first of all, the majority of taxpayers don't get the mortgage introduction at all. Now, because the value of the mortgage introduction is tied to the value of the mortgage, which of course is tied to the value of the home, it's heavily concentrated on the high end. So the wealthiest homeowners get the predominant amount of the mortgage introduction.
I'm a survivor of Hurricane Katrina 2005 back in New Orleans, Louisiana. I made up my mind that I was going to start saving after I lived in an apartment for 10 years. So what I did was I saved up for the last 2 years. And I said, I'm gonna own myself a home. And that's what I did. We're homeowners. So why do the wealthier gets the big tax break and I don't get it? Why? We're one, homeowners.
It's important to keep in mind that many offer the mortgage interest deduction, as an encouragement for home ownership, but really it's an encouragement for home debt, which is something very different than ownership. We've also found that in housing markets there's very tight supply. The mortgage interest deduction will allow borrowers to bid up the price of a house, and ultimately it ends up being a subsidy to the seller, not to the buyer, because the price is raised.
So there's a few modest reforms to the mortgage interest deduction that can make a big improvement in the lives of low and moderate income homeowners and allow for significant investment in rental housing programs that serve the lowest income people. So specifically, the changes that we call for through the United for Homes campaign are, one, to lower the size of a mortgage on which you can deduct your interest from $1 million down to $500,000. The other change is to adjust from a deduction to a non-refundable capped credit.
If I can tell the people of Congress that affordable housing is so much needed in the community, within neighborhoods, within the communities.
Thank you. And we hope to have more videos to come, so stay tuned for that. I'll start with Carol. I saw you really reacting to the video. What we're going to do is we're going to ask each speaker to kind of give their take on why reform needs to happen, but we'll start with Carol, and maybe you could tell us why you're reacting so strongly to that.
That's an amazing video. So, great job, National Low-Income Housing Coalition. You've got Mark Calabria there, who is wonderful. I think he's in the administration right now.
He just left Cato, which is a libertarian think tank, now is working for the vice president's office on tax reform issues. We're hoping that we have an ally in the White House that might be willing to push for MID reform, from his position too.
And then you've got some wonderful stories of homeowners from New Orleans and renters, and you've got wonderful graphics. And I work for Congressman Keith Ellison from Minnesota. I will point out the remarks today are my own and should not be interpreted as representing Congressman Keith Ellison. I've been his legislative director. I've worked with him for 5 years, and just to see the video, just to see all these amazing, energized people is wanting to work on the mortgage interest deduction is fantastic. The whole reason you have a bill is because Sheila asked my boss, Congressman Ellison, to introduce a bill like this at a Congressional Hispanic Caucus event in 2011, which is always a fun thing when someone asks a member of Congress to introduce a bill in front of a whole bunch of people, and he's never talked about it with his staff.
That's a good tactic.
And he said, yeah, I'll do that. How hard could this be? And so I came and worked with him after he had already promised, and I was part of that organizing group to talk about how can we help him get this bill introduced. And I'm like, well, I guess the best way to help him is go work for him and write it. And so that's what we did, and we've introduced it for 4 Congresses now. It's currently has 2 co-sponsors, Barbara Lee from California, and G.K. Butterfield from North Carolina. So those folks from those areas, good job. There's 432 other members of Congress. Not that I can tell you to lobby them, but it's just things like this. The Diane's speech today, the videos. Diane and Mark had a wonderful piece published, an op-ed. Those are the things that my boss has a very active Twitter account, very active Facebook. And whenever you get great op-eds, when you get wonderful videos, we can tweet that out. We can send dear colleagues to every member of the House, to their housing staff, and say, hey, did you see this? Co-sponsor our bill. So just having these really clear, strong, visible, easy to understand, easy to digest things are really helpful. And the one thing I learned in working on this bill, when I first started working on it, I'm a member of Toastmasters. I don't know if other people are a member of Toastmasters. Yes. And the first time I kept talking about the bill, I would go to different clubs and talk about the bill. And the first couple times, like, people freaked out. Like, they just couldn't hear the way I was talking about it. And the way that you all have changed the language, so it's not, we're eliminating the mortgage interest deduction, and we're, just like, you're much more precise about we're replacing it, we're converting it from a deduction to a credit, and it's a rebalance. That is really helpful language if you wanted to organize events locally, if you wanted to have a housing forum. Having this kind of frame, I found worked a lot, and it's worked with my boss. And so this language that you heard today is time-tested, and the fact that you repeat it a number of times is also important, because the first couple times any homeowner in the room tends to sort of freeze up, but I think you've made the case really strongly, and connecting it to low-income housing. And Diane, as she said this morning, is 100% right. This is the moment. And to have a piece of legislation that you can organize around and talk about and hold members accountable, have you co-sponsored yet, is a really great opportunity. So congratulations, good job.
Absolutely, and the bill that your boss introduced also builds on the Dear Colleague letter that he circulated earlier this year. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and the
the
success
bill?
of it.
You want me to talk about the bill?
The bill and the Dear Colleague letter that he circulated.
Which Dear Colleague?
We
do
so
like
many
one every 2 weeks, so.
So earlier this year, Keith Ellison introduced a Dear Colleague letter. That's a letter that members of Congress send to each other to send a message about a particular issue that they care about. And for the first time, we got 34 Democrats on the letter saying
right.
it was time.
Yes. That was the one to the Ways and Means Chair. Yes.
That's right.
Yes. So what we did, because like I said, we do different letters. So like when Matthew Desmond's book came out, we did a Dear Colleague on that. When he was on PBS NewsHour, we did another Dear Colleague on that. And these are just letters that we send through the electronic system. But we had a sign-on letter where we asked members of Congress to sign on to a letter to the chair of Kevin Brady, Ways and Means Chairman, which is the tax committee in the House, and to the Democratic ranking member, which is Richie Neal in Massachusetts, asking them that any change to the mortgage interest deduction, any change to housing tax benefits should be done in a way to provide more resources for affordable rental housing. And we got the biggest level of support we've ever had, which is 34 Democrats signed that letter. So we're really trying to think of ways to raise the visibility of this issue, build on your grassroots organizing and your constituent work to make sure your members of Congress know that the mortgage interest deduction isn't a third rail, and it's regressive, and it's poorly targeted, and we need to change it in a way to address the affordable rental housing crisis.
Absolutely. Now we'll switch over to David. Your organization has run a campaign about turning the tax code, which is upside down, to right side up. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and your interest in reforming the mortgage interest deduction.
Absolutely, yeah. Good morning, everybody. You're a very brave group to gather this early to talk about tax policy on a Monday morning, I'll say that. Sarah's absolutely right in everything you heard this morning. We have a couple things going on right now in our country, right? We have obviously huge issues around the middle class, a lot of that around home ownership and housing. We have this opportunity, which Diane talked about, which is huge around tax reform. Whether it happens or not, the momentum right now is larger than it has been in a long time. In 1986 is the last time we had comprehensive tax reform. And there's a lot of people out there right now and activism out there in response to the current administration, to actions going on in Congress, this energy and this activism that is out there, which is wonderful. When people, like what you're going to do tomorrow, go weigh in with your representatives, talk about issues that matter to you, talk about specific bills. What you don't hear a lot about is people weighing in on tax policy. And that's why it's so great that you all here are gathered talking about the mortgage interest deduction reform today, because tax policy is, frankly, it's boring, right? It's scary. There's all these arcane terms like deduction and credit and all these things. It's intentionally confusing. But the reason why we have to care about it is because for the same reason that Bonnie and Clyde robbed banks, it is where the money is, right?
That's right.
So many of you may have heard, you may be very well versed in this, you may have just heard about it indirectly about the president's skinny budget, early proposed budget that came out with all these huge cuts, cutting these programs, cutting this here and there. When you total it all up, the cuts that they're trying to squeeze from these domestic programs are tiny compared to the numbers we're talking about here. So to give you an example, you can't even really wrap your brain around it. You know, at CFED, we're very focused on what we call the wealth building, the asset building subsidies in the tax code. People often talk about tax rates, and rightfully so, but part of these asset building subsidies is the mortgage interest deduction reform. And when you total them all up, when you look across retirement, home ownership, higher education, all these different areas, it's around $700 billion each year. Every year, $700 billion that we spend money on. And we believe this is fantastic. These are the things that help create the middle class. They help build wealth, right? You can get a college education. You can get a home. You can have a secure retirement. You can have access to health insurance is subsidized as well. The problem is these benefits are, as Sarah said, they're upside down. The vast majority of these benefits go to people who have much higher incomes. And when I say higher incomes, I'm not even talking about the top half or the top quarter. We're talking in many times the top 10 or even 1% or half of 1% that reap enormous benefits. And we believe that whatever happens with tax reform, you have to turn this right side up. You have to, the simple premise that the people who need the most help, purchasing a home, saving for retirement, for education, should get the most benefits, and the people who need the least should get the least. It's as simple as that. And when it comes to the mortgage interest deduction reform, I think we are looking at 4 pieces in particular. And I think one huge piece of that is for folks, we have an affordability crisis in many communities right now, housing affordability crisis in many communities, as you all very well know. And there needs to be this credit, the deduction needs to be redirected in that way. So, you know, that's a huge part of it. The other thing that we need to think about is there are renters who want to be homeowners someday, and we need to help them get there. And part of what CFED's done a ton of work on in the past is around programs called individual development accounts through the Assets for Independence program. Some of you may be familiar with this, which help people basically matches for savings. You know, for every dollar you invest, you get a certain match, $2, $3, and you help people build up savings in that way for some kind of long-term goal. One of those goals is home ownership, and this is another area where the mortgage interest deduction, which is roughly around $60 billion alone just for the mortgage interest deduction, could be used to redirect some of that. Then, you know, during the stimulus bill after the crisis, as many of you know, there was a first-time home buyer's tax credit that was temporarily included in the stimulus bill, which was very successful. Evidence showed that it wasn't a right-side-up credit that was in there because it was targeting folks and predominantly going to folks who are lower income. That would be another great thing to have. Help people actually purchase homes, make it over that hump after they have savings, make their down payment go a little further to get them in there. And then lastly, you know, once you get into a home, as many of you, if you're homeowners, you know, there's a lot of difficulties in becoming a homeowner. You can need a new roof, or your water heater can go out. Like, it's a very expensive and precarious thing, especially if you're lower income, when these huge expenses come up. You know, maintaining that in some form through a credit, as we heard earlier, a credit instead of a deduction, because not everyone is able to itemize. It's accessible to everybody, and it's flat, so everybody gets the same, and it's not providing disproportionate benefits to the wealthy is another huge part of that as well. So for us, we want to see all these elements and the redirection of the mortgage interest deduction in that form, because, you know, as you've heard repeatedly throughout today, you know, this is one very clear thing, and you hear politicians say this a lot. The mortgage interest deduction does not promote homeownership. It doesn't. All it does is it subsidizes debt. It subsidizes higher mortgage debt, and that's all it does. So we want something that actually promotes homeownership, that actually helps with renters and housing affordability. And with $60 billion on the table alone, and, you know, looking even further beyond the mortgage interest deduction, if you look at homeownership programs overall, it's around $230 billion a year when you look at real estate taxes and other tax provisions there. So if anyone tells you the money is not there, they obviously don't know what they're talking about, or they don't want to make changes. So I think these are important things to remember, and think about the full spectrum of how we can make all these programs work better for low-income folks, whether they're renters, would-be homeowners, or new homeowners.
Absolutely. And Agatha, the National Council of Raza has taken on MID reform as one of its areas of interest. Maybe you could talk a little bit about where your organization is coming from, what perspective that you bring to this. conversation.
Great, thanks. Ooh, thanks, Sarah. So NCLR is actually an endorser, supporter of the Unite for Homes campaign. We're very proudly so because we really feel that Latinos and American workers, just generally, lower income workers, really don't benefit from the existing MID. I'm not sure how folks are familiar with NCLR. We're the largest Hispanic civil rights organization in the country, and we have a mission to promote life opportunities for Hispanic families across the country. And we also work with over 300 affiliates across the country, 50 of whom are helping people become first-time home buyers, helping people with their financial capability, and also offering free tax preparation services. And I was, as I think about this, and as I was preparing, how am I gonna, what am I gonna say about NCLR's position? I thought about myself and the last time that I prepared my taxes. Of course, it's tax season, so, right. It's like, oh, Agatha, you should do your taxes, right? Like, that was a good reminder. But I was also thinking to myself, how many people actually need help preparing their taxes? Because the tax code and the tax system is really quite complex, right? I mean, when was the last time, I don't know if we get a show of hands, when was the last time that you did not need help preparing your taxes? I cannot, who never needed help? I can't remember the last time.
We're gonna come to you when it's our time to do taxes, since you're volunteering.
So, NCLR is really committed to advocating for a tax code that really provides Latinos and low-income households with, opportunities to build wealth, savings, and and a quality of life for their families. But part of that is also simplifying the tax code. And I think one way to do that is actually, in a very simple way, in a very targeted way, is by reforming the mortgage interest deduction. By converting the deduction to a tax credit, we feel that this would really be in line with other progressive tax credits, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Childless Tax Credit, which many low-wage workers and Latino families really depend on, because actually a lot of Latino families are considered kind of, in the spectrum of lower income and lower wealth families. So when we think about tax reform, we think about programs and tax reforms that really reduce poverty, provide a sufficient revenue, so sufficient funds that can be raised to grow and build our economy, and we'd be able to invest in our future, which includes incentives for homeownership. And why is homeownership so important for Latino families and, frankly, for communities of color and families of color? It's because largely there have been federal policies that have stripped our communities of wealth. So many of you may know it hasn't been that long, but it's almost about 10 years ago where we had the financial crisis. Latinos, as a group, lost over $600 billion in household wealth. So when we talk about Latinos, when we talk about wealth building, we really talk about homeownership as a way for families to actually rebuild and recover a lot of the gains that they lost from the crisis. So because the mortgage interest deduction only applies to homeowners and wealthy tax filers, it really disfavors Latino and Black families. There are at least 3 factors, which I think some of my colleagues have really, especially David, you had just mentioned a few of these, homeownership rate, home values, and household income, that really account for why Latino and Black households are less likely to itemize deductions and on their tax returns or have large deductible interest payments. So think about this, just a few stats for you to take with you, perhaps when you're going on your Hill visits. I also want to make another plug for this video because I think it's an incredibly important tool and a good way to prepare yourself when you're going on the Hill. I know the first time that I went on the Hill, I didn't know what to say and I froze up, but having a video that helped guide me and showed me examples of what to talk about was just incredibly helpful. So keep the video, show the video on your Hill visit. I think it's a great tool. So just to leave you some stats, I think that are really, could really help make the case. Homeownership rates for families who are at below the median income is at 49%. That's significantly lower for families who are earning at or above the median income, which is currently at 78%. For Latinos, the homeownership rate currently is at 46%, which is significantly lower than a white homeownership rate at 72%. This means that more than half of Latino households are ineligible for this deduction, the mortgage interest deduction, because they don't have a mortgage and they don't have a home, versus less than a third of white households. And shifting a little bit to home values. So white households tend to have tend to own homes with higher values than Latino Black households. So in 2015, the median home value for white households was $180,000 versus $158,000 for Latinos and $125,000 for Black households. And thinking a little bit about the value of the homes and how much people actually paid for these homes when they were first purchasing. So in 2015, white households spent about $126,000 on a home versus Black households, which spent $95,000, and Latinos about $120,000. And a particular key point I wanted to point out, which CFED has really done some great work looking at the down payment divide and the amount of and the racial wealth gap, pointing out another particular savings indicator more recently, and in 2015 in particular, white households were actually able to provide a larger down payment when purchasing a home than Black and Latino families. So white homeowners, who bought in 2015 were able to actually put down between 16 and 20% versus Black and Latino homeowners who were able to put down 3 to 10% in down payment. That's significantly different, largely because of the lack of savings and wealth in the home. So this is particularly good. And I think, finally touching on median household income. So white households, tend to have a higher household income, medium household income than Blacks and Latinos. And largely that's because white households have, or more likely generationally, have diversified incomes. And that comes from Social Security, access to retirement benefits, access to a pension, interest and dividends, and rental income. So it's really interesting how much the tax code impacts our ability to build wealth, but also helps us preserve what we have in our home.
Great, yeah. And just to hit on this, because it's reminding me that this is an issue that seems to span both, not just renters and homeowners, but it's also a unique opportunity for us to be working with Republican, unusual friends on this fight. One of the things I've heard the most back from the Congressional Hill visits that we've done is that Republicans are so interested in this because they get so little money from the mortgage interest deduction. Most of it is going to a handful of higher income households on the coasts and we're in higher cost cities. And so from a rural perspective too, there's no real reason to preserve the mortgage interest deduction as it currently is because none of their constituents are getting these dollars, or very few of them are getting these dollars. So it's something that's bringing together renters and homeowners, rural areas, progressives. It's kind of a unique issue in that way. I wanted to turn to Sharon. Sharon is working on a statewide bill in California and doing a lot of the campaigning around that. I wish you could just talk a little bit about the work that you're doing there.
Great. Sarah, thank you. I'm Sharon Cornu. I'm the political director for the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. We work in the San Francisco Bay Area. And after you finish your federal income tax return in California, if you turn to your state federal tax return, there is a mortgage interest deduction at the state level as well. And I'm here today to talk about AB 71 by Assemblymember David Chu, now in the California legislature, and part of our legislative package. And it would remove the mortgage interest deduction on vacation homes or second homes. Now, there are 39 million Californians, but only 200,000 claim this mortgage interest deduction on a second vacation home. And so removing that deduction would put $300 million a year back into the state low-income housing tax credit. We've really been struggling to restore funding after our governor eliminated redevelopment a few years ago, and it's made it very difficult to invest in communities across the state. So we're excited about AB 71. And Sarah, that's as much as I'm going to say about the policy. I want to talk about the politics and how we plan to pass this and some of our campaigning. In partnership with Housing California, the CCRH, Rural Housing Organization that's here, organizations in Los Angeles, San Diego, Fresno, we had a 200-person lobby day in Sacramento in March. And for the first time, we brought residents from a particular state Senate district in Modesto and Turlock who came to Sacramento and met with a state legislator about their own neighborhoods. And she changed her position from being a no vote on one of our bills to becoming a co-author. So with those wins beneath our sails there, we're trying to move forward and actually get out into the districts, including some districts where we haven't traditionally organized. Housing California, a great partner, and I don't want to take credit for their work, but this is such a wonderful idea. We stole it from them, and I hope you steal it too. They're doing Hour of Power. They're taking organizers and trainers and materials out into sites, meeting with residents, doing a short training, talking about people's stories, getting them ready to make the call, and then they're calling state legislators in the districts where they are to encourage their support for AB 71, reflecting the success we had with this one state senator. We're excited about this grassroots mobilization. It's worked for us in other cases, and we hope to continue partnering with other groups to move it forward. We have some enhanced communications capacity around a new legislative action center where folks can go on our website and support legislation, reach directly to their legislators. We think that's an important communications tool in the e-world, but we're really eager to work with real people in the real world to have them talk to their legislators. Thanks.
Wonderful. And before I turn it open to questions, I just wanted to ask our panelists, what have you found to be the most persuasive argument when you're talking either with homeowners or legislatures? What's the thing that's really sunk in and connected with people that this crowd could be using when they're talking to their members of Congress or others?
I have something very specific, which gets to the point, your point about that very few parts of the country benefit from the mortgage interest deduction as it currently is, and that is the Pew Trust has mortgage interest deduction data by zip code. And when I send out a dear colleague on behalf of Congressman Ellison, I always have a link to that. And then I know if when I was working with Keith to get the bill introduced, we had a 3-ring binder of all, and where are my Minnesota folks here? I know we have a lot of them here. Thank you. Chip, especially, talked to Chip a lot. I had a binder which showed him exactly who got the mortgage interest deduction in his district, because most members know about the affordable housing needs. They know how long the waiting lists are, but that fear of harm, who is going to be harmed, and when you can really show, you're talking a few $100s less for households making more than 6 figures a year compared to all the benefit that can go to all the folks who need affordable housing. So that actual Pew Trust mortgage interest deduction by zip code data, it's on their website, is so helpful.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I would say also, like when you're going in to speak with staff, or you're talking about these things, I think 3 things that I always think are highly effective. Number 1 is data, as Carol said, like having data, local data, showing this is the impact in your district, in your state, and being able to show that is incredibly important. CFED, we put out, many of you may have heard of it, a data scorecard every year, which contains metrics on a variety of things of economics and housing and healthcare that are down to the state level. We have some data at the local level too, and we work with our folks in our networks to make sure they get that data in their hands, so when they go to speak with their congressmen or with their senators, that they have that data, because that specifically makes a huge difference when talking with staffers. The second thing I would say is stories. Like if you have stories about people who benefit from programs or people who are harmed, being able to take in personal stories from people from the district or from the state is hugely important. And then the third thing is when you're talking, especially when you have a great bill out there, make sure you make the bill number and make sure you make the ask. Do you support this bill? Where's your position on this? Get that feedback. Put it out there in front of them. You can go in, you can have a nice conversation, and they can kind of talk about how things are nice and so forth, and how they like the idea in general, but at the end of the day, if you're really trying to push a bill forward, you want to ask them. And they may not give you a straight answer. They may say, we still need to think about it and so forth, but you want to make the ask and you want to make sure you follow up afterwards as well.
I would say repeat and just reinforce the need for data. Bring the video with you. Can I say that again? I think the use of local data, bringing the Pew data, bringing information about the local homeownership rates, the number of renters, and actually showing what the measurable impact would be if you actually converted this deduction and the MID became a tax credit, and how many more families would actually be impacted, and also the economic impact. Sometimes housing, and I'm going to refer a little bit to our panels that were yesterday's the first day of this particular policy forum, where it was really important to just emphasize the economic impact, the bigger picture, how this is actually going to help the local community, the neighborhoods, the city of Miami, the city of Sacramento, wherever you are, because I think it's really important for your congressmen and your representatives to understand that it isn't just the impact of one particular household, but this is going to have a broader impact in the entire community. So as the best as you can to use the data to create that larger story will be really impactful, I think.
And Sharon, any closing remarks on that?
Yes, have a great day tomorrow on the Hill, but when you get back home, use that lobby day packet. There's a fabulous packet of information with a list of all of your representatives in your state, and make sure that we check off each member in each state so that they're hearing from people, whether it's on Capitol Hill tomorrow or back in the districts in the coming weeks and months.
And I'll just say a lot of this information that people are talking about are available on a table in the back of the room. And I'll say that the argument, a lot of what I've been doing is meeting with Republican offices because it's a Republican-led Congress and House. And the arguments that I've seen most resonate is the idea that we can be helping more people without adding any spending to the federal government. So it's a much more efficient use of dollars, and it's something that I think is really appealing to Republicans. Also, they know about the housing needs that are going on in their state and district. And this is a way that they can do it in a fiscally responsible way too. So when you're talking with your Republican members, that might be something you want to address. But I want to open it up to any questions people might have. Yes?
It seems to me there's two big...
We have a mic coming for you. Sorry about that.
I'm also going to say that all the mic runners, we're going to hold on to the mic, so please don't try to grab it from us. We might bite back.
Can you just address what some of the fight or pushback you're seeing coming from, say, the realtor lobbies or the finance lobbies? Those seem to be the two biggest groups that would really battle this, because it is really, and the MID currently is encouraging people to take mortgages, and it's going to hit there.
So that's a really interesting question. So the realtors are very much against any changes to the mortgage interest deduction. And I think at this point, their message to Congress is just to not do tax reform. That doesn't seem like a very winning argument when talking to Republicans, where this is one of their top priorities. But what we have said, or it's interesting because they're looking at different reforms. This might be getting a little too technical. They're looking at different ways to reform it. One of the ways that they seem to be leaning towards is raising the standard deduction, but capping the amount of itemized taxes that people can claim. And so what that would do is it would make it so that more people are taking the standard deduction instead of MID. It's kind of an indirect way of very slowly killing off MID, but without saying that they're doing it. And that's what they say, Republicans say, that this is a winning argument for them, because how can you be against tax breaks for more low and moderate income homeowners, right? Or low and moderate income people in general, right? And that's good. That works for us too. It also splits the industry apart. So we're hoping that as Congress moves forward with the changes that they go forward, even if that is increasing the standard deduction, that might give us new allies that we can work with, like the home builders, possibly maybe some other groups that will start saying, all right, well, if you're going to reform MID in this way, we've got to keep housing dollars within housing. They might be coming at it from a different interest or point of view, but we're hoping that that could help a little bit undermine some of our opposition to it. But
Yeah.
the question is, if they're doing comprehensive tax reform, will these groups have, maybe not NAR, but the home builders and others, they might have many other much bigger issues that they're trying to fight for in tax reform. This might just, maybe it's fifth on their level, and hopefully they're distracted by those other bigger fights that they might be contending with.
And the realtors are in a lot. We talk to realtors all the time in congressional offices, both at the district and and here in Washington, D.C. The one piece that we've talked specifically about is to just ask the realtors how many homes they sell for more than $500,000. It's almost none. I mean, maybe in Hawaii or parts of California, New York, yes, but those are also the places with the biggest housing needs. And so when my boss talks to realtors, he'll say, who's going to buy these homes? You're not just selling a home once. You're trying to get a whole pipeline of home buyers in. And if we've seen millennials, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, those are the new home buyers. That's the new generation of homeowners. And if they don't have enough for a down payment, if they don't have a credit score that would enable them to buy a home, then if you as a realtor, your pipeline of potential sales clients is getting really, really small. So having a system that supports current homeowners with a lot of money to buy bigger and more expensive homes, there's fewer of those people. You make your money not on selling one home and having people hold it for 20, 30 years and get a big deduction. You make it on the first-time home buyers and building a relationship and helping them upgrade or getting bigger homes. And if you're incapable of doing that because that pipeline is blocked because of the affordable housing crisis, you're shooting yourself in the foot.
And I'd also say that might be a really interesting opportunity for people when they're going back home to their states and thinking about how to organize around this. If you're not, you should do it everywhere, but especially if you're in a state that's not California or New York, this is an opportunity for you to reach out to your state realtor groups. If for example, if you're living in Kansas and doing housing affordability work there, the realtors there probably spend less than 1% of their homes are above $500,000. They could see this as a business opportunity because with the credit, more people would have the resources to be able to buy a home.
And the credit is a lot clearer to potential homeowners too. You're like, well, will I get the deduction? How much will it be? And you're like, well, no, here's your interest rate. You get 15% of that. That is your homeownership benefit.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Just make sure. We can go to him in the back. Sorry. Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Thanks. So first of all, congratulations to all the panelists for pushing this needed reform. When I spoke to Barney Frank 10 years ago about this, he said it was the mortgage interest deduction was sacrosanct and we would never get meaningful reform. So kudos. So it seems that one of the reasons this is really on the table right now is because the Republican Congress and President Trump, more than just caring about making the tax code more efficient, they're down with trolling rich liberals. And if you look at where most of the mortgage interest deduction goes, it's the richest, most liberal metropolitan areas in the country. So my question is, what sort of response are you getting from your traditional housing allies that often tend to live in the richest, most liberal parts of the country?
So that's actually kind of the fun part. On this issue, there are many issues that we don't agree with more conservative members of Congress. This is something where we are actually very aligned with them on. And so the more that we can encourage Republicans to think about MID reform as a real, a good thing for them to do, the better for us. Of course, we've gotten pushback from, let's say, Schumer's office and other, coastal Democrats, or some of them, not all of them. Our message to them is more of a, push it as long as you want. Fight MID as long as you want. But at the end of the day, Republicans are going to have the votes to reform the mortgage interest deduction. Your job is to turn to Plan B. And Plan B needs to be about keeping the savings in housing. And I think that's something that they understand. A lot of it comes down to whether or not they'll do a bill through reconciliation and they only need Republican votes, or if they do a bill maybe through a broader bipartisan bill, and which Democrats are going to peel off from the rest to vote for it. So we're kind of working every avenue. Again, pushing Republicans to look at this because it would help their constituents a lot and not a lot of risk. Pushing more progressives to walk the walk about what they say that they stand for, and this is an issue that they really should be more vocal on. And then working with those moderate Democrats, the ones who are most likely to actually vote for a bill at the end of the day. And so wherever you and your delegation fit on that spectrum, there's an opportunity for you to be engaging with them. Anything else people want to add?
And we found in talking about this, the specifics, as Agatha said, really matter. I think there's a fear sometimes that, oh, if you change it to a credit, all of a sudden people will lose $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 subsidy, and going in and showing the actual amount of subsidy is maybe $1,000, $1,500 to a household making $300,000 a year. I mean, really? And those are also the places with the highest housing needs, the longest waiting lists, the people paying 80% of their income for housing, and they're the ones who need the help, and this is the way to get it to them.
Maybe one more question? Right here.
The map showing how few people this would affect is really good. Can you talk about the distribution and number of people who would get the credit?
Yes, so on the United for Homes website, there are state-specific information that you can find. You'll have a state map, and it'll show you which counties are more impacted by others, but it will also show you the number of homeowners in your state that do not receive the mortgage interest deduction and who would benefit from a tax credit. So that all that information should be available to you in the resources that we have on our website. You should check it out. Before we end for the day, I do want to go to maybe our last slide I have, which is about a tax march that is happening on April 15th. The National Low Income Housing Coalition is really proud to be an official partner to the tax march. It's happening in Washington, D.C., but also in more than 90 cities across the country. This is an opportunity that we feel very strongly about. It's pushing for economic fairness through the tax code. We think the United for Homes campaign fits really well within that framework. They are also pushing for things like tax transparency, encouraging President Trump to release his tax returns. So if you have an interest in that, you should think about that too. But we see this as a really great opportunity to be working and getting more of the public engaged and interested in this as an issue, especially as Congress is turning their attention to tax reform. And we're working with partners like MoveOn.org, Indivisible, Credo, the National Women's Law Center, Coalition for Human Needs. There are lots of groups that are starting to come on board, and this is a great opportunity for you too. If there is one in your community, you should feel free to either join, try to figure out how to organize that. If you want to create one on your own, in your own city, if there isn't one already available or planned, let us know, and we're happy to help you with that too. That's it for today. Thank you, guys.